Okay, attendees are filing in now. Cool.
Okay, so let's start then. I would like to welcome you all in the fourth webinar organized by the Other Universal Consortium. Today's webinar is entitled, following Professor Aditya Nigam's latest book, Decolonizing Theory, Thinking Across Traditions. The book, like today's seminar, is an invitation to rethink theory away from its exclusive Western origin and to explore how the history of modernity can be retold once we depart from its Western autobiographical narrative. So today's webinar will take the following format. We will start with a 30-minute presentation by Professor Nigam, followed by Professor Sitas and Dr. Bangerezako, who will comment and respond for about 10 minutes each. And then we will have around an hour for Q&A. I will be reading the questions that you can submit on the Q&A section of the Zoom. So I will present all of the speakers now to allow for a smooth transition of the webinar once we start. So with our first speaker, Professor Aditya Nigam, is a political theorist based at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. His recent work has been concerned with the decolonization of social and political theory, while his earlier work focused on ideological and discursive formations and the relationship to the constitution of political subjectivities. In particular, his interest lies in theorizing the contemporary experience of politics, populism, and democracy in the non-West, and in interrogating the received philosophical histories of capital. Professor Nigam approached this question by treating the non-West as the ground for doing theory rather than a field for application or testing of standard framework derived from the Western experience, an approach that we will probably be discussing in more detail in this seminar. He is the author of numerous books. I will start with The Insurrection of Little Selves, The Crisis of Secular Nationalism in India, 2006, Power and Contestation, India since 1989, with Nivedita Menon in 2007, After Utopia, Modernity, Socialism, and the Post-Colony, 2010, and Desire Named Development, 2011. And his latest book, Decolonizing Theory, Thinking Across Tradition, 2020, is the topic of our seminar today. Our first discussant is Emeritus Professor Ari Sitas. Professor Sitas is a sociologist, poet, and dramatist. He is the chair of the National Institute for the Humanities and the Social Science, a Gutenberg Chair at the University of Strasbourg, and an Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Cape Town, responsible for the project entitled Recentering Afro-Asia, which explored the movement of people, material, musical, and symbolic form between 700 and 1500 CE. Our second and final discussant is Dr. Heidi Bangerezako. Dr. Bangerezako recently completed a 2-year postdoctoral research fellowship at the Makerere Institute of Social Research, after graduating from the same institute in 2018 with an interdisciplinary PhD in social science, specializing in historical and political studies. Her interest is in a decolonizing study of the Great Lakes region from a feminist, political, and historical perspective. She is completing work on her book manuscript tentatively titled Decolonizing Burundi's Indirect Writing, History in the Oral Grain. So join me in welcoming our 3 speakers for today's seminar, and I will give the floor now to Professor Nigam for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Suren and Samir and all the organizers at the Center for Humanities Research and the other universities consortium. What I'll do is first present 2 general points and then go into some of the more specific things that I discuss in the book. And the first general point that I want to make is about this theoretical conjuncture, what I call the specific this moment, as seen as a theoretical conjuncture which, to borrow from Walter Mignolo, is I see as a moment of epistemic reconstitution, which is to say that the entire paraphernalia of the humanities and social sciences and the social and political theory on which it is based is in a way already being rethought, in a way already being reconstituted. We are probably aware of some of the things which are happening. We are not aware of some of the things which are happening, but it is a global moment where I see a whole lot of different impulses come together in the constitution of this moment. And very obviously, this moment also builds on an earlier moment of critique, which was initiated by the by post-colonial theory, post-colonial studies, very importantly, the work of Edward Said. And it had opened up an entire way of, or entire range of critiques of dominant Western knowledge and Western theory. What we are now undertaking, or where we situate ourselves today, is in part a continuation of that movement, but in part a radically different movement, which is constituted by a whole range of different impulses, some of which I see have their own very distinctive, should I say, national trajectories. For example, in India, there is a very specific history of the idea of decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing theory. Some of it went into the blind alleys of indigenism and nativism. I'll come to that in a moment. But there has been an abiding concern which was always below the surface. In places like Africa, right from the time of the mid-80s, or from the 60s, in fact, the famous Mugio Thiongo's decolonization of the mind, to continuing concern, which in fact, one of the things which provides the impulse for this book, the entire range of things that happen in the post Rhodes Must Fall moment in Africa. Now, a third important element of this moment is the post-September 11 moment, in a sense. And I think that has, in a global sense, brought about almost a veritable earthquake in terms of where philosophy and theory are concerned. So now all these come together in from another vantage point, from another impulse, from another vantage point, which is actually nothing to do in that sense strictly with the domain of knowledge. It comes more from the point of view of a whole range of movements which are struggling against capital, against the ravages of capital and the development model and so on and so forth. And all attempts to actually critique development, post-development and so on and so forth have now led to a situation where, and here I think the indigenous people's struggles have been quite fundamental in terms of positing a different kind of critique of capital, which is not modernist in that sense, which positions itself actually against this entire historical determinist drive emanating from the West in the post-industrialization world, industrial revolution world, and where basically increasingly there's a realization that the whole business of capitalism, the whole business of development, etc., has been to make elephants climb trees, so to speak. And then when they cannot climb, then you have all kinds of criticisms about these societies not being capable, not being either being too slow, not yet ready for being modern, and so on and so forth. So in a way, much of what I am doing in this book stems from this particular moment, but as I said, all these elements which go back to a larger past, to a longer past, and which in the Indian case, for me, also connects with a whole lot of anti-dispossession, anti-displacement struggles. The second point that I want to make here is that the project of decolonizing theory, in my understanding and in the argument of the book, is not about a search for a pristine pre-colonial space for two reasons. The first reason is that no region has ever been hermetically sealed space, insulated from other currents of thought or mingling with other cultures. Whether it has happened through travel, trade, migration, diffusion of religious ideas, even wars, never has the world of ideas remained closed in on itself. Second, the colonial experience and Orientalist discourse, which actually reconstituted traditions of colonized societies in quite significant ways, leaving little scope for accessing pre-colonial knowledge in any uncontaminated way. Decolonizing, in my view, then is not a nativism or an indigenism, but fundamentally about thinking our times, our own complex present, standing on our own feet with resources drawn from different traditions of thought, including our own, but which means not depending also only on what is handed down to us from the received theory of or received philosophical tradition of the West. Now, does my claim therefore mean that we have no access to the past whatsoever or to that lost world? Now, all these are within quotes, past, lost world, and so on and so forth. In a way, they are lost. In a way, we can never reach them. But in another sense, it then leads me to the two most substantive theoretical concerns which run through all the chapters of the book and through the entire argument that I make. Firstly, in a very fundamental sense, the argument made in this book is an attempt to look for an outside. Again, outside is within quotation marks, because as a space inhabited by modes of being and thinking that I have called, borrowing from Ernst Bloch, non-synchronous synchronicities, and which is the second critical concern. So there are these two things. The first, the attempt to see the outside, to locate a space for the outside. And the reason I put it in quotation marks is because all notions of outside actually refer to a structure or a totality of which it is an outside. And what I am trying to do in this book is to actually get away from any notion of totality, which therefore makes the notion of an outside, even a constitutive outside, problematic. The second concern, which is non-synchronous synchronicities, has to do obviously with different modes of being that coexist. Now let me quickly coexist in our present. Let me quickly elaborate my stance on these two concerns as they undergird the explorations in the book. One, the argument for an outside is actually an argument against totalizing categories like colonial discourse in the context of the above, which I have discussed earlier. But also more importantly, categories like modernity, capitalism, state, and so on. Anyone who has worked with these categories knows that their totalizing grip leaves us no space to understand modes of being that are either, again, within quotes, traditional or non-capitalist. There is no way of understanding or accounting for the agency or subjectivity of the non-West or of the global South, as long as we see all that is non-capitalist and traditional as simply posited by capital in one case and modernity in another case. And since both have their Mecca in the West, there appears to be no outside to the West as well. And now this is actually a sustained argument which runs through the book, which obviously I cannot anyway summarize in a very short time. But I do want to underline that this business of, so there is of course, a strong Hegelian tradition and a Marxist tradition, which draws on Hegel also, where this mode of argumentation is very clear. And many of us who come from that tradition or are familiar with that tradition would easily recognize this business of the past being posited, or tradition in fact being already reconstituted by modernity and therefore already modern. Similarly, that there is no space outside capital is a common belief among all shades of Marxists the world over. Now, when I'm referring therefore to the question of the outside here, I am not interested in so when I'm referring to the outside here, I'm not necessarily referring only to the Hegelian Marxist tradition. If we actually look at even let's say the liberal tradition, this is the other dominant tradition. It is not that liberalism uses the same language or the same mode, and in fact, it does not concern itself formally with totalities and so on and so forth, or a larger philosophy of history. But in a way, the assumptions of liberal philosophy and liberal theory also, despite its preoccupations with the individual state and so on, are fundamentally are basically that their modernity is inevitable, there is a certain historical logic to it, and so on and so forth. And the entire basis on which we understand or see historical development as progressing, that fundamental notion of modernity as progress underlies all liberal philosophy as well. So even though my own engagement is not directly with liberal philosophy, but I would make this argument that this is not something specific to the Hegelian Marxist tradition. Whenever we confront the non-modern or non-capital, we confront other modes of being that goes other than the ones that are normatively held to be normatively ideal. So whenever the question of discussing these non-modern or non-capitalist or non-rational modes of being are brought up, the normative, desirable normative ideal is the modern, the secular, the rationalist, the capitalist other, rather than the pre-capitalist, the non-rational, and so on. And now these are all commonplace things, but what I'm saying and why I'm bringing this up is that these modes of being and knowing and thinking, which are often in the case of non-moderns, the same thing. The mode of being is inseparable from the mode of knowing and thinking. And therefore, and these which are designated as past actually accompany the modern like a shadow throughout its entire career. I have called it in one of the chapters, in chapter 5, I have called it the paramodern. And I will argue, I suggest in the book, and I am prepared to discuss this or follow this up a bit. Not right now though, which is that this is something which we can see in this today's era of the Trumps and the Boris Johnsons and the and Brexit and so on, that this is not something which has been completely eliminated and superseded by the modern, even in the West. That it continues as its subterranean existence, and which is why paramodern is a domain where all that we have expelled from the modern continues to live a subterranean existence. Now, to put it differently then, what I'm doing in this book in a way, and that is the direct engagement which will be apparent in different parts of the book, I take a step away from the particular kind of anti-historicist argument that we find in the work, for example, of someone like Dipesh Chakraborty. In that rendering, there is no such thing as tradition or the pre-modern. All that is touched by modernity is, by that fact alone, already modern. So 19th century Santhal or tribal rebellions can only be redeemed if they are first claimed as modern and as political. And in a sense, the normative structure of the modern and the political and the secular, etc., of Western modernity does not ever come into question, because we are simply first justifying all these by first claiming for them the status of being political, that they're not pre-political, and that they're not also non-modern or pre-modern. Now, my problem is that if one steps aside from this argument, then it also poses a challenge for us. And that is the challenge, in a way, the book tries to deal with. How does one do this without falling into some kind of a linear historicism? That is one of the key questions. In each of the chapters, therefore, I locate the simultaneous co-presence of the modern with the non-modern or even pre-modern, the secular with the non-secular, the rational with the non-rational, capital with non-capital. The linear story of the past being superseded or overcome by the present without residue is replaced in each case by a story of such simultaneity and co-presence. In each case, I argue that what we see as residues or survivals are not really residues, but constitute an active presence out in our present. Interestingly, such presence is supposedly presence of supposedly past forms can often be reactivated and re-energized by the modern itself, as we can see, and in my one in chapter 5, which is the chapter called Secularism and Subalternity. I actually discussed the case of a 20th century, early 21st century, like 2001. There was an incident around Delhi and its neighboring areas of which was known as the Monkey Man. The emergence of this mysterious figure of a monkey man, a man which people claim to have been seen and attacked by and so on, but basically a monkey, but a kind of hybrid. But the figure of the monkey man was actually not something like the other instances which I have discussed, which is of, let us say, the 19th century tribal rebellions or the early 20th century discussion of the peasant revolt in Chauri Chaura and so on. But in fact, it is activated by modern technology, it is activated by the internet, it is activated, in fact, by the great achievements of science, the exhilarating achievements of science that are suddenly becoming available to people. So in that sense, what is it? This is something which actually reminds me of a debate which went on in the 60s and 70s on the state of capitalism in socialist societies and so on and so forth. This is part of the debate which was happening in a large number of non-Western societies about why capitalism does not develop in non-Western societies. But simultaneously, there was also this debate going on where question of restoration of capitalism in Soviet Union, or is China socialist enough, or is it not, and so on and so forth. And everywhere, actually, the question which was being posed was about the survivals. Now, the survivals in terms of commodity production and so on were often understood to be reactivated. In fact, they're not just survivals. In a way, they acquire a new lease of life within the new dispensation. So now, that's where the parallel with the socialist instance ends. But this is a question that we actually need to think. There's something which runs through our modern experience, especially through the entire 20th century, and with the rise of the internet. So we actually see the reactivation of what we thought were already dead and gone past elements as suddenly erupting in the middle of our otherwise happy modernist progressive universe, where universalism prevailed, where all kinds of particularism had been apparently ostensibly left behind. So now there are 4 thematic chapters, and I'll quickly just mention some of those in the remaining 10 minutes that I have, 7-8 minutes that I have. So apart from the other chapters, including one which is on a kind of critique of Zizek and some of the stuff he had written, especially in relation to India, but more generally, which have a bearing on this question of non-synchronous synchronicities and this kind of anti-historicism. But there are 4 chapters which I deal with where thematic questions are dealt with. One on modernity, the second on the political, the third on secularism, and fourth on capital. Now, I am here using these again as shorthand because my question in each of these is, are these categories the categories through which we need to look at these non-Western societies? These are categories we have received from the West. When we go into researching the Indian past, we actually have the category already in hand. This category has absolutely nothing to do with the Indian past. The term has never been used or expounded or explained by anybody. Right up to the 1940s, which is the moment of constitution building, that is when secularism starts becoming a matter discussed in India. So when we look at Indian pasts, different kinds of Indian pasts, that is not the question which is which animates. Similarly, if we look at the world, so medieval Christendom was a fusion of ecclesiastical and temporal power and so on. So the church and the separation of the church and political power is a big deal. But that fusion never took place in most of the world. In the Arab world, it's not there. Already in the 9th century, 10th century, we have Arab philosophers debating on government, on the city and so on, the virtuous city, without ever having to think of questions of separation and so on. There are questions of religion, there are questions, but these are primarily still the questions of statecraft are being discussed in secular, quote unquote, secular language. But that is not their language. Now, similarly, the question of the political, on which we have more or less understood, taken the story of the West, where it is the disestablishment of the church, the emergence of the political as a separate entity, independent entity, and therefore, and of course, it's the rise of the absolutist state and the struggle against it and so on. So that the question, the story of the political that we have learned from the West is a story which also has to do with that specific kind of monotheistic structure of power, which does not exist in most of the world. And so in the specific chapter in my book, I deal with it mainly with debates in Indian history, but I also access a whole lot of other discussions on Southeast Asia and Asia and other parts of South and Southeast Asia, where the mandala form, for example, which is a form of dispersed foci of power, which is dispersed power, it has a very stylized model, which is not obviously the way in which it exists in real life, but nonetheless, that model has something to do with the question of sovereignty never really becomes a question in the way in which it emerges in the discussions of the political in the West, because there are no sovereign in that sense. Similar, and finally, the chapter on capitalism, which of course has to do with a whole range of things, and where I'm fundamentally arguing, and this ties up with my argument in the first chapter, which is on modernity, that therefore, if we look at modernity, the point made by Anibal Quijano actually set me thinking on something which I've been struggling with for some time, where he says that, look, if you're actually identifying modernity by the existence of rationalism or secularism or things like these, then strictly speaking, you can find this kind of modernity in any society, in any epoch, across historical epochs. So what is it that is specific about this modernity? And I think the only thing that is specific, the real West's contribution of the West, so it is not producing the modern or modern knowledge and so on, or the discourse of modernity out of thin air. It is sourcing a whole lot of things from China, from the Arab world, from India, from various parts of the world. But what is distinctive in the West's contribution are two things. A, the discourse of rights, and on which is obviously based on a certain notion of the abstract individual, the equality, notions of equality of the abstract individual, and so on, but equally premised on the fundamental question of bourgeois property right. So the discourse of rights and equality on the one hand, which sounds very benign when you say rights and equality, and forget that the fundamental point there is the question of property, bourgeois property right. And the second thing which the West contributes is, along with this discourse of right, is capitalism. So that is what makes it possible to, and this notion of capitalism in my definition, and which is where I come to, which is what I come to towards the end of the chapter on capital, is that this is not, I don't use the term capitalism as a mode of production. I rather use it in the sense of a mode of being, in the way in which we use terms like secularism or nationalism and so on as ideologies, you could call them, or you could call them modes of being, which are specific to the modern world, and where the figure of the possessive individual, what Macpherson called the possessive individual, and the possessive individualism as a philosophy, becomes the ruling philosophy, and that in a way provides the ground for the emergence of what we see as capitalism in subsequent times. So from this, what I'm actually, even though the chapter on modernity comes first, what I'm actually arguing is that there are longer and larger histories of each of the things which go into the making of modernity, into the assembling of modernity, but which go back to longer histories, centuries earlier, not in the West, but centuries ago in China and the Arab world, in Persia, in India and other parts of the world. So in that sense, what we know as Western theory today or Western philosophy today is also, in a sense, a distillation. It draws on various other traditions of thought, of science, of philosophy, and so on. So I'll end here, and we can take up things later.
Thank you, Professor Nigam, for your rich and thought-provoking presentation. I will invite now our first discussant, Emeritus Professor Arisitas, for his intervention, which would be around 10 minutes. And I would like to remind our attendees that they can send their question in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we will compile them and read them at the end of the two interventions. So Professor Sitas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the book, and thank you for the input. You're right. You know, the whole world looks like a construction site at the moment, with all kinds of epistemic reconstitutions or constitutions. I don't know what the correct word should be, you know, because the minute you say reconstitution, all of a sudden Like when you say Renaissance, you get into trouble. So then, of course, this idea of modernity has been haunting sociology and sociologists for a long time. And it is well defined there through the work of Parsons, where he grabbed Tönnies Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft and created his pattern variables. And everything that is on the left-hand side of his pattern variables is traditional, and everything that is on the right is modern. And there's reams and reams of American, German sociologists who have refined that to almost extinction. And our battle in sociology has been that Europe's ascendance and hegemony was not a virgin birth. As you say, it was a process of entanglement that involved. You know, it wasn't a virgin birth. It didn't pull itself out of its own bootstraps. It didn't out of its own genius, out of its racial purity, out of anything, but it was a vicious entanglement with the rest of the planet. But the minute you do that, you come to the Quijano problem, that everything was always modern anyway, since time immemorial. You know, so any slight change is modernity with that definition. So I think what I enjoyed about the book is that it moves away from these tons and tons of deconstructions that we have experienced in the last 30 years, which leaves us, you know, just want to show that kind of modernity and the language around the discourse is a discourse of power. And all of a sudden you can breathe more freely, but we don't know what to do with this oxygen that we're breathing in now, because we have not theorized, we have not constructed anything. All we've done is deconstruct and showed the emperor to be naked and looked at his flabbiness or her flabbiness. I mean, it's not, we didn't do this, and I enjoy this attempt. And having dealt with a lot with the pre-1500s type of history and looked at some of the philosophers you have mentioned, there is a lot of borrowing happening around. Things move extensively. You know, just to give an example of the kind of movement, you know, at one point in time, people who were seen as pagans and Neoplatonists in Alexandria are being chased by the Christians, and the same Christians are chasing from Aleppo and Damascus the Nestorians. Where do they find refuge? In the Sassanid areas in Persia. What do the Persian Sassanids do? Is create the primary schools of knowledge and learning, and they get all these people there. And then later Baghdad rises on the ashes of that. And they were exporting 1,000 musicians a year to China, the Persians, of whom many were Indian. You know, so in Chinese music gets constituted in the 10th century by imperial decree, by an order, you know, in Farsi, to mix the musical schools of the world and create Chinese music. So you're right, there is no essence that you can find everywhere. You can find constellations, you can find borrowings, and even in Europe itself. The reason why you do not have the Oriental and the Phrygian and so on music in classical European music is because it was banned. They said this leads to sin or temptation. Again, it was defined in contrast. So, you know, there is a lot of work, in other words, to be done in terms of constellations of knowledge that have been buried, and it's very important. And again, you're right. But even if we find that, and we find beautiful stuff there, and also horrific forms of slavery as well and other things, and massacres and so on. But once we've done that, what do we do with that? How do we reconstitute or the epistemic formation? How do we look at, let's say, the world in the year 1000, and you look at the map, and I show it to my students, and you show that there are 17 cities, not rural formation, 17 cities with more than 100,000 people with Baghdad being more than 1 million, and 14 of them are on the east, and only 3 beginning to emerge in the so-called West. And you start seeing, you know, just there was interaction, there was movement and so on, and a lot of things were suppressed, and we have to recover them. But that is a cultural act, important decolonizing cultural political act to do all that. We still need to arrive at theory. And you're right again, we are trapped by the Zizeks and the Badiou's of this world. And I enjoyed thoroughly the way you've dealt with Zizek and the arrogance primarily of his language, his expressions, and so on. You know, just that confidence. You know, I can give anecdotes as well. I have experienced it profusely with our friend Badiou. So there it is, and it's a cul-de-sac as well. So all those people who are speaking about the movements of communism, social movements, the Cairo, the rebellion, the springs, and so on, are speaking in a language that is totally prohibited at the moment in terms of any new theorizing. But to get to the heart of the question I have to you is that, are we, well, it comes in 3 parts. The first is that, is the problem with Western thinking so far, and with the help of our diasporic friends who are helping it along beautifully at the moment, is it the question of a partial universalism? Or is it a question of the need to check it totally out? Are we saying it is a false and partial universalism, and therefore we need a proper one, decolonized, with everybody, as you seem to indicate in the book, you know, this borderless kind of thinking? Is that the project? Secondly, your outside and the inside. For me, the way I look at the outside is everybody that has been defined as deviant by these emerging hegemonic powers. All those others, all those deviants, behavioral, existential, you know, in whatever way they were defined, in their discourses of defiance, in that, surely, in contradiction or in contestation with what is going on, you have ideomorphic ideas through which we can constitute knowledges. Is it the same as your outside? You know, I'm not understanding exactly your outside and your paramodern. You know, are these the voices that will allow us to do a sociology or a social science or humanities with people, as opposed to the old model? The third question is that we decolonize theory for what? What is it about? What is it? What are we going to make it do for us? And how can it open up new vistas, and for what? So we know that if this modern period for me produced anything that's of any value, it came out from the struggles of predominantly Black slaves. The idea of freedom emerged from there, not from Locke or Hobbes. Or equality came from women and worker movements. Or equality, whatever we call now, has come from indigenous movements, you know, more empathetic to nature and so on. But these things are hopefully are transcendent. They're not caught up in what we call the West's project. You know, so there are something that has been achieved, which creates a direction, which creates kind of a pseudo-teleology at the moment to strive for. Is our decolonial thinking, apart from being an important political, cultural, emancipatory act, what should it be doing at the moment is a major question for our construction sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sitas, for your intervention. And now we will have our last discussant, Dr. Bangeri Zako, again for a 10-minute intervention.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank Professor Ningam for the book. It's a wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it, and it's quite pertinent for the time being. So this book offers us a critique of modernity. It gives us a critique of academy, of social sciences, and it warns us against how we reproduce categories and concepts from Western academia. And he is not telling us to reject them, but to not limit ourselves to those theories from Northern academia, but to think across traditions. So he's asking us to think independently of them and of, he says, breaking out. So our context is different, so we cannot reproduce theories that are coming from a different particular context, and how we also need to have our own homegrown questions. The book also highlights the importance of local languages in knowledge production and theorizing and countering the continuation of a colonial mode of knowledge. And interestingly, he talks about raw materials being sourced from the continent, taken to the metropolitan to theorize. And he also talks about import substitution theorizing, building our own theoretical structures. I was thinking that this critique, it's also been made on the continent by scholars in terms of rethinking our conceptual framework and the frame of reference, such as the work of Yusuf Bala Usman, and having an interdisciplinary approach and new conceptual fields of analysis and a regional approach, rather than just limiting our study to the nation states. So I felt very much at home reading this book, as this is our philosophical and even I would say political approach at Maiza and Makerere, so in terms of decolonization. So what is striking is how urgent this decolonization of thought is. The book argues that Western episteme, capitalism, modernity is harming the world. So at the end of the book, the book says that our own survival depends on us being able to theorize a way to the world, to a world that doesn't harm humanity, the environment. So I thought perhaps you could expand more on this. You talk of an urgency that which we are living in, and how theory can offer us a way out of our current condition. So I felt like this was very much in tune with feminist theory, theorizing from our own lived experience, and theory as a necessary practice that will transform society. The book approaches its study through a historiographical debate. It tells us that this is not an agenda for decolonization, but to think through critical theoretical issues and to kind of step back from the academic social sciences and theory, and to also, when we are doing our own work, to look at theory alongside with historical, like in terms of political science, looking at it from historical and anthropological works, and to do it from our own vantage points. I found that in the book, the subject, which is usually assumed to be male, in this instance, the subject was always female. The personal pronoun was she, so that was interesting. Another important point I thought the book makes is to look at modes of being that were once consigned to the past and which are with us. So it tells about this pre-modern or non-modern ways of being, and which modernity was supposed to eradicate with its superior knowledge, but which it has not. So there's this space where human lives, and it's called in a Puranic mode of living. It's described as a world where people believe in goddesses, spirits, good ones, bad ones, and as it's described also as having this non-modern rational belief, which is referred to as paramodern. So as in the rational, secular, modern vanishes these modes of being of this people. So it also explains it as a space where groups of people with such beliefs were able to be rallied by fascists, which is in inverted commas, and in order to safeguard what is considered as traditional. So the book reads this space, this paramodern space, as one where one would say the political ills of society emerged, the fascism as a clash between modern versus non-modern, for the sake of defending some form of tradition within the nation state. So I'll get back to this paramodern concepts. So the book informs us that decolonization is not seeking some pure origin to the source or some untouched indigenous philosophy, but yeah, thinking across tradition. And you also show us there's a similar trajectory in the West and India, where metaphysical philosophy moved to social and political philosophy. So it's theorizing, the book is theorizing the political from non-European context, and you introduces interesting concepts such as the mandala concept, dispersed foci of political power, and which explains political approaches, movements within post-independence India. It was interesting, that concept was interesting because you locate it, you tell us that much of the modern is shaped by power relations and conceptual universe in the pre-colonial world, much of what is seen in the present, which reminds us of an Africanist debate, which was about that, it's not necessarily African, it's a debate on the continent, which was about that the pre-colonial was decimated by the colonial versus the continuation of pre-colonial political thought to the present, or it's transformed, the transformation of this pre-colonial political thought during the colonial period, and how it survives or becomes something else post-colonialism. So the book shows us that modernity is not simply a Western product, and provides us a critique of the autobiographical story that the Western modernity gives itself. My question were, how do you differentiate decolonization and decoloniality in your own work? Where do you draw the line? And do you have what is your critique of the decoloniality school? You also tell us that we need to do theoretical and philosophical labor of written histories produced in the 3 continents, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and enter into a dialogue with them, which is great. So how do we also make sure that we study how do we become aware of the power relations that were reproduced and produced by these historical narratives? Because it will not be enough to just pick them up and read them and use them to decolonize. So how do we think about also these binaries, which you critique, but also in a way reproduce them? You talk about being reactivated in the present, non-modern versus modern, rational, irrational, secular versus non-religious, pre-modern versus non-modern ways of being, which run across the book. So can they be more problematized, and to show us how we can move beyond them? Tradition, which tradition? Is it the one that's reproduced during the colonial period? Is this the one that's produced by modernity? Is this the one that's idea of the tradition that's produced by the present? How do those, how do we challenge these binaries? Because if we keep them, they also reproducing a sort of modernity discourse. How do we get out of them? There's a critique by Talal Asad of reason, for example, being rooted in myths, or Michael Tausig, who tells us about the rationality of capitalism. So how do we avoid thinking that these alternative visions of a modernity, secularism, capitalism, they're not just the other side of the same coin. How do we think independently? So this Puranic mode of being, where there's a belief of living with gods and goddesses, is how do we theorize it? How, because it's not explored enough. It's seen as it's only explored in terms of its danger, that it can be sort of captured by fascism and being misused. But how can we use it to tell us about the people's own experience of life, of how do these beliefs are able to describe and articulate their concern? We don't learn much about that. We just see it's almost represented as a danger. Those who are living with gods and goddesses. Yeah. You also talk about how in a way, there's a part of the book where that tells us that we have to also look at the work, that the work of Western scholars can sometimes do excellent work, unlike non-Western scholars who can be too immersed in their own cultures. And, but how would we not see that Western scholars will come with also certain categories, their own concepts of thinking and theorizing, and how do we not see that being reproduced in their work? I'm not saying that non-Western scholars cannot be critiqued, but how, because I just read that they can do more excellent work. So I felt that comparative was a bit problematic. But overall, I really enjoyed reading the book, and I'm looking forward to your responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bangarizako. Professor Nigam, would you like a few minutes to answer our two intervention and their question before we move to the Q&A? I think your mic is off.
Yes. So thank you. I'll just take a few minutes to respond to some of the questions, especially raised by Heidi. Is it okay if I use the first name?
That's fine.
Okay. And Arisitas raised certain questions, most of them, I think, by way of comment. I will not respond to all the questions, obviously. And some of those raised by Arisitas, I think, are partly linked to the questions raised by you. So, but let me take yours, because some of those I think need a little more elaboration, which in the course of that will also respond to Arisitas's points. Not all, so some of his points. Now, I think by and large, I really enjoyed your comments and the points you raised. But I think there's some possibility of misunderstanding on two or three things, which I should dispel at them right now, right away. So the first thing is the question of the last 2-3 points that you raised. One about the Puranic mode of being, the second about Western and non-Western scholars, and the work of non-Western scholars being too immersed in their cultures and so on. Now, and then the critique of decoloniality. I'll go to that at the last, whether there is. Now, actually, I don't really see the Puranic as only in terms of the danger. In fact, I have used it in a fairly expansive sense. You're right that it is still in its very early stages of elaboration, and it is something which I have to still work on. This is in a sense, I think, the opening towards a more sustained engagement with the Puranic. For people who are not familiar with this term actually comes from a certain Hindu lexicon, where the Puranic religion, so Purans are texts which are more popular texts of stories, origin stories, and so on. There's a lot of stuff going on there, but these are very different from the high texts, Shastric texts, or the classical texts of Hinduism, like the Vedas and the Upanishads. And the Purans are basically meant to intervene in and draw towards Brahminical culture sections of the population which actually lay outside the domain of Brahminism. And there you have all kinds of beliefs, especially the figure of the mother goddess, or not just the mother goddess, but various goddesses. So latest addition to this is Corona goddess. So Corona and COVID-19 has now become a goddess which has to be propitiated through yajnas and so on, through performance of not sacrifice, ritual performances and so on. So now this is actually part of a larger mode of being, which is not only in the way I'm using the term or deploying the term Puranic. It does not refer only to Hindus, and it does not refer only to what I refer to as the proximity in which the fascist element, of which I'll come to in a minute. But the important thing is that, let us say, for example, the Muslim population. Then the figure of the Pir and the Jinn is actually a very pervasive, it's a benign figure. It's actually a figure to whom people go for. The Jinn is supposed to take care of, have healing powers. You go and ask for various fulfillments, wish fulfillments, and so on. And similarly, you have in a range of these Puranic gods and goddesses that kind of a relationship where you are basically confronting the drudgery and the alienation of modern life by being in close proximity to these spirits or the ancestral spirits and so on. So I do not certainly
I think we lost Professor Nigam. Okay, we apologize for this technical difficulty. He should be back online in a few moments. Okay, we apologize for this little technical problem. We're still waiting for Professor Nigam to reconnect and continue his intervention. Welcome back, Professor Nigam.
Sorry, that was, as I told you, this might happen. Lately, it's been a little erratic.
No, it's okay. We're used to this new format of webinar and its unexpected cut. You want to continue?
So, well, I don't know when it will go again. Let me just quickly say that, so that is one part of the thing which I wanted to clarify. The second thing, which is very important, I'm not saying that Western scholars are free of biases and so on, and that only non-Western scholars. In fact, then the whole project of decolonizing would be meaningless. What I actually say is that it is not as simple as saying that. So decolonizing is not as simple as simply saying that all that non-Western scholars say is right and all that Western scholars say is wrong. There is actually a more difficult intractable problem. There are agendas on both sides. So when, and that is something which I deal with at length in the context of a debate in chapter 4, which is on the political, where most Indian scholars are actually trying to show that we are like you. And that is, many of them are Marxists and they believe in the certain kind of universalism, and they are actually trying to say that, but we are, that's not, this is only a minor difference of form, but actually Indian state also is as, so all the questions that you think of in the context of a unitary state are brought in the context of the Indian state, where a number of Western scholars, some of them actually coming from African studies also, who talk of the segmented state. It is not a unitary state. Now, the reason they are able to actually see this difference is because they have the experience of the highly centralized monotheistic Western state, and you can see the difference. But so that is why I'm saying that it's a what I say in that particular part which you're referring to is that it is not as simple as saying that anything that is produced by non-Western scholars can be simply taken as the truth. That was my point. Now, the critique of, I actually don't have a critique of decoloniality like that. I just don't use the term decolonial because I think it has a very specific reference to Latin American, Caribbean history and so on, and a particular tradition of thinking from the Americas, which may or may not, I mean, in some parts, it ties up with what is happening in other parts. But we have, in a way, a somewhat different history. I mean, for example, if I take the violence of colonialism in the Americas, it is not something that, if today there is many people from India in the audience, you can be sure that many of them will immediately say that decolonizing means you're talking about Hinduism, you're talking about indigenism, you're talking, and Dalits celebrate modernity, they celebrate colonialism and so on. So what I'm saying is that actually this specific history of the colonial experience in India is far more complicated, and I suspect in other parts of the world, everywhere it's different. And so our approach and our responses to it will also be different. It is at this point I want to just also one quick response, quickly respond to one question by Arisitas, one point raised by him, which is about partial universalism and so on. So look, my my understanding of the situation of the problem is there is no and any universalism will be equally bad, in the sense that if it tries to be a universalism, the only way we can think of theory in a context transcending sense, but not necessarily universalist. So every theory has a context transcending ambition, but it's not necessarily always universal. That universal is, in a sense, an empty space, as Laclau would say. So what becomes of that universalism is actually not something where you have a predetermined content, a moral, political content, or a normative content of that universalism. So when we look at these Western categories, these are not categories which are simply explanatory categories. They have a certain normative ideal which they posit. And so I think there's no question of junking Western thought. It is part of our common heritage, and a lot of it, as you yourself further gave so many fascinating instances of how different kinds of modes of knowledge and culture and so on are assembled, through which Western knowledge itself also emerges, that it would be self-defeating to junk Western knowledge. So it is to sort of put it in its place, and there what thinking means, what do we do with decolonization was your question. And I think what we need decolonization for is for two things. Not to go back to any indigenous pristine pre-colonial past, but to be able to think today on our feet, not to simply take, if they have cashless economies, we want cashless economies, they have bullet trains, we want bullet trains, they have smart cities, we want smart cities. And that is what something is happening where when questions of, let us say, concepts of Ubuntu or Sumar Kosak, the well-being, Buen Vivir, are being raised in from the indigenous knowledge systems, they are actually positing a future and a different way of reconstructing our present. And I think that is where the second part is important, which is that when we are able to draw, and this ties up with the last point that I want to address, which Heidi raised, what tradition? So the tradition is not tradition of what you can access from the past, but that tradition which actually still exists. It is lived. The Puranic which lives today, or any other form of the tradition which lives today among common people. I'm not talking of the way in which tradition is harnessed by politicians, and that is a separate question of how it is colonized and deployed in the political domain. I'm not talking of that. But when you actually go to common people who live their daily lives according to a certain mode of being, according to certain ways of doing things and relating to the world and so on, that gives us a clue to a certain different world, which we remain impoverished in the context of if we deal only with, or if we are confining ourselves only to categories of Western knowledge. So I'll stop with this and we'll go for the next round of questions.
Thank you, Professor Nigam. What I will be doing is collating the question based on my understanding of the themes that are common among them. And obviously one of the main theme or question that almost automatically arises every time we talk about decolonization or post-colonization. And these have been questions that have been raised a lot, for instance, in the reception of Said's work, is the question of what is at stake? What do we do with this approach to decolonizing theory politically? And you've been talking about this, hinting at it, for instance, with the idea of thinking today is on one's feet, as what could be the implication of this. So I'm going to take two questions that kind of invite you to think more politically what is at stake in this theoretical move. One of them asks about how can we reimagine a new left, if you would agree on using the word new left as a way to characterize the political implication of such an approach. How does one reimagine a new left, keeping in mind the discourse on decolonization, thinking of tradition, since that is a very urgent necessity today. So how do we imagine it politically? And another question pertained again to something I think you've mentioned, having to do with the misuses of these approaches, sometimes if I can put it this way. How will the approach of decolonization ensure liberation, as in an epistemological decolonization of people, and not end up forcing people into accepting this quote unquote decolonized epistemology, in turn colonizing others? So how do we think these theoretical move outside of the theoretical world in which we live, and more pragmatically, politically? Especially that, I mean, if we take today's, for instance, what's happening in France, I think we have a lot to say regarding this latest event that goes beyond simply the binaries of the debate as it is being presented in Western media, and more specifically in the deeply laïque French Republican approach. So I'll start with these two questions and then we'll pick up on other questions.
Yes, the second question is a little more difficult question in the sense that I think there are no guarantees that epistemic decolonization will not lead to another kind of imposition or reimposition and so on. I think the only guarantee for us is to not let our categories of thought congeal and to continuously keep up the element of criticism. Really, that is, but that does not mean that therefore we do not undertake this project. So the thing is that we go into it with the same sense, despite the experience of 20th century socialism. We still fight battles against capitalism. We still might talk about socialism, knowing full well that there is no guarantee that life after capitalism will be, at least we are clear about one thing, that the old eschatological notion is not workable, that it is not like once you have done away with capitalism, you enter paradise again. It is not, it is something which, actually it's very interesting when Mao Zedong talks about socialism and contradictions of socialism in socialist society and so on. He draws from a very different kind of cosmology and a tradition within Chinese thought, where contradictions don't end, where end of capitalism and the big communism is not the end of all kinds of contradictions and so on. So there are always going to be contradictions, there'll always be some conflict and so on. The question therefore is, and I think the lesson from there that I take, which is something in some fashion makes more sense to me, because in the tradition from which I come, there is no beginning or end of time and so on. But the first question, which is, how can we reimagine a new left? I think that is a very important and burning question today. And I don't think it's possible to answer it in any detail or any concrete way today, except for indicating two things. One, that new left cannot be a reanimation of or an re-intensification of the modernist project. That in a way, if we look at the 19th century capitalism faced its most profound challenge from the European working class. Today, capitalism faces its most profound challenge from indigenous populations, from peasant populations across the third world. That is where capital is being actually forced to confront different kinds of very powerful movements across the three continents of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So that is one, that it cannot be a reanimation or leave alone a re-intensification of the modernist project. The second is, I think it has to also rethink and move away from the specific forms of property. So there was an assumption that until the whole world becomes capitalist, which is to say, when all the earth has been commodified, when all the forests have been commodified, when all the land has been made use of industrially, till you have done that, the ground for socialism amid higher materials of civilization called socialism cannot be built. That has been proven to be an impossible. I mean, today it's challenged by the challenge of climate change, but it is something which is actually not a workable idea. It's not even a theoretically sustainable idea. So how do we then think about if we agree with the fact that capitalism is not everybody's destiny, that what happened in Europe was specific to Europe in the 19th century or 18th century or 17th century. If that is not our destiny, then in countries like India, for example, small property is preponderant. 70% or so or 80% or so is small property. And it is not like the West, where you either have big owners of capital and they have people who are only either selling their labor power or their mental labor and intellectual labor and so on. So if these forms of property have to be accommodated in a post-capitalist scenario, you have to actually rethink what exactly that was. That capitalism is not synonymous with commodity production. It is not synonymous with market relations. Market and commodity production precede capitalism by centuries. So various forms which we, in a particular kind of Marxism, began to associate with capitalism are not to be, I mean, we have to understand capitalism differently, therefore, more as a kind of specific industrial form which emerges after industrial and now post-industrial, which emerges in the 18th century. It's not necessarily all market is not, and all forms of property are not to be destroyed for a new left project to take shape.
Thank you. And it's interesting that you're ending on capitalism, because we have a few questions on, if I can put it this way, on the outside of capitalism. And I want to pivot using the word capitalism from the political implication of your approach to this notion of an outside you presented. So one of the questions that has been raised is, how do you consider capitalism? And if it's only a being, then what is the opposite of this being, or what is the outside, and what should we aspire for or work for according to that perspective? And we have another question that also tackle these two notions. As one of the attendees wrote, the outside is not really outside, it's haunting us constantly. It haunts us as a mode of articulating the tension of the inside with the outside. So this outside might give us an out from possessive individualism of capital, but I'm also wondering about the violence that might be accentuated when the paramodern mixes with capital. And obviously the question invites you to reflect on this possibility of a mixing of the paramodern with capital. So what would be the outside of capital, and what should we be striving for in that sense? And if you could say a few more words on the conception of outside here.
Well, big questions actually. First, let me start with respond to this with an example. So, if you look at, let us say there are two kinds of transactions that I have in my daily experience in India, and in I think most parts of the third world, non-West. These are the kinds of experiences you will have where every single part of, so let us say if I'm going to give my car for repair, and from the stage of the car being picked up to repair, this has actually happened with a friend of mine. So in Palestine, so I was just kind of thinking of the way in which these things happen. So it's picked up, it's taken, it's repaired, it's returned, and I asked this friend, so how much and what did he charge for? And so the charge was only for the actual repair. The picking up, the returning of the car, all that stuff was basically not monetized, right? Now, if you were to give this to, not to a garage like that, but if it were to be given to a showroom right here next to my house, then every single step of this would be monetized, and it would be actually made into a commercial transaction where you have to pay for every single step of the way. This kind of monetization or commodification, which actually pervades all kinds of transactions, is something which we don't find. I mean, my daily life, in my daily life, I don't actually end up having like transactions which are accounted for, right? Which are accounted for in terms of the state's taxation, for example, in terms of the documentation of property, for example. So when I buy vegetable, when I buy fruit, when I buy various things, even the grocery and so on, I'm not entering a department store where every single thing is accounted for, put into a receipt and taxed, and so on. Now, this way of making legible the economy is tied very closely to what we understand as capital. It is the formalization of the informal in a certain way, where the formalization has to do with also the power of a certain what we actually understand through Marx and Marxism and so on, what capital and capitalism constitutes. But what is not accounted for in that understanding is this vast domain. And so I am increasingly of the view that actually if we look at the history of capitalism, this is not something which has happened automatically, spontaneously anywhere. Capitalism was a state project. Everywhere, actually, it was the state which, it is not capital which then takes hold of the state. it is the modern state which actually first reorganizes property in a way where it can be it is documented, it is legalized, it is formalized, it is taxed, it is brought into the frame of the formal economy. And from there emerges a certain type which we identify as modern capitalism. Now, it is a different matter that this modern capitalism also transcends the it acquires a dynamism of its own. It goes beyond what the state might have intended in the first instance. But 90% of the transactions in India, this is one of the interesting things in that discussion, in that chapter, which I draw from one of the Indian Marxist thinkers who was an economist, Kalyan Sanyal, who worked on the informal sector of the economy, and whose basic argument was as an economist. So he's not dealing with it in a kind of broad general. He actually is dealing with matters statistically also, in terms of what exactly is this vast domain which he calls non-capital. And that domain is governed by a different principle than the logic of accumulation. People there are not in the business, they are producing, they are selling in the market, they are making some little bit of profit, but that profit is not for accumulation. It is what he calls the need economy. That's in a certain sense, it fulfills a certain need and it remains at that level. So that is something I think which is a form I do not identify or I do not think of as part of capitalism. So when I think of capitalism, I think of that more corporatized formal domain, which functions on the logic of accumulation, and not. So when I'm talking of the outside, I'm talking of actually all these different spheres, including peasant economy, including indigenous, if you can call them economies, and so on. So yes, I think that is the two questions. Now I think this time he's gone off. Ah.
Yeah, I think it was my turn to lose the connection.
Yeah, but you came back fast. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm assuming that you finished answering in the turn I was. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, I'll just ask Sepide if she can send me back the question because I don't have them on the Q&A. I will pick up on two questions I have noted down. In your introduction to your talk, you presented the various moments that came together to or enriched the decolonizing approach from the 60s onward, and that took different point of entry to critique the modernist state project from a more cultural perspective to a more anti-developmental, if you want to call it this way, perspective. And we have two questions that also look at the interdisciplinary nature of your approach. And one of them asked about the everyday lives of working class and peasant, and whether that approach could enrich decolonizing theory by providing it with particular insights of modes of being that would form one of the way in which we understand theory differently. And another of our attendees asked about the relationship with other turns, such as the feminist turn or the environmental turn, and whether these also would play a role in rethinking decolonizing theory. So one of the questions pertain, if you want, to the more interdisciplinary nature of this approach and how it, what kind of conversation it could have with other turns that have decentered a certain approach to theory. But there is also a question that has to do with form. When we talk about decolonizing theory, one of our object of critique is also theory with a capital T in a sense. And the question is, should we also start thinking theory beyond its existing form and more like poetry, for instance, or think of different ways of inhabiting the theoretical, whether through art, culture, theory, poetry, or other form. So I'll stop with these two questions for now.
Yes. And the first, this question about the everyday lives of peasants and workers, what was the point there? I think I missed it.
The point was that in models of urbanization taken from the West, there is a particular model for understanding how urban-rural development should take place, which has to do with the displacement of the community and the emergence. And one of the questions has to do.
I don't know if we'll go.
And one of the question has to do with the anthropological work that has been done on the lives of workers and peasants, and whether this could form some bedrock for rethinking a form of decolonizing theory, whether that could be one of the grounding for a rethinking of that decolonizing theory.
Oh yes, sure, certainly. I would say yes, because that was precisely my point in responding to Hades on one of our questions, that when we talk of tradition, it is what is lived. It is not what is there in some imaginary space. And most people, the poor in particular, the peasants and the workers, are not economic entities alone. And they have their larger conceptions of life, their relationship with other things, with nature, with other human beings, with animals, with spirits, and so on. And so that provides us a different way of entering rather than this high modernist view, which basically wants to recast the world within a particular frame, which is very elitist. And in fact, if you ask me, I think one of the things, and I appreciate the question, therefore, that one of the things that lies at the root of our current miseries is precisely the fact that all radical projects, however much they may talk of workers and peasants, have actually such deep investment in that modernism that they end up being elitist. That modernism cannot but make them elitist. They can never actually think of workers and peasants in the lives as they live them. Those lives have to be transformed in a vanguardist mode. That vanguardist mode is a modernist vanguardist mode. So that is one a short answer to that question. Otherwise, there are many other dimensions to it which one may think of. Second, the relationship to other turns, feminist turn or environmental turn. And so the environmental turn and the feminist turn are both. Now this is, it should be very clear by now that I think that these are all part of the longer process of decolonization, if one were to think of feminism not just as a Western product. It is certainly Western, but it is perhaps the first moment in which the abstract universalism of the modern is challenged, and where questions of lived experience are foregrounded. And once that happens, I think it opens out a space for all other kinds of epistemic critiques to emerge. So in that sense, the feminist turn links up in a larger or a broader sense with the project of modernization. So far as the environmental question is concerned and the other terms you're talking about, definitely. Their link is far clearer in a certain sense, because there it is also a question of forms of property, modes of being, different forms of life, including indigenous lives and peasant communities and so on. Yes.
Thank you for that. We have two questions that are a bit wide, but I think we can compose with them, and they have to do with the application of your approach to the case of India. So one question asks, how would you situate universal in relation to modernity in the context of immediate political engagement in a country like India? And then the second question start with the idea of your assertion for modernity as a nonlinear conception compelled me to think of Bruno Latour's conception of non-modernity, which sees many society out of the very domain of modernity. How do you see Indian modernity with the continuity of tradition, which keeps low caste out of knowledge creation, possession, in your project of decolonizing theory knowledge? So two questions that tries to think the implication regarding the political situation in India.
What was the Latour question? I didn't get the Latour question.
The Latour question is, how would you see Indian modernity in the context of a continuity, as the question states, continuity of tradition which keeps low caste out of knowledge creation possession? How do we understand these two dimensions, I would think?
And the first is, sorry, I'm getting a bit confused. So the first one was?
How do we think the universal in relation to modernity in the context of immediate political engagement in a country like India? So I think both of them are trying to look at the coordinate of India between universal and modern, or traditional and modern.
Right, right. So, okay, so first the question of universalism. Well, in a way, these two are also tied. These two questions are also linked in a way. The challenge to universalism comes precisely because of these excluded, so let us say the lower castes, particularly the former untouchable castes, the Dalits, but feminists, but the intermediate castes and so on. Now, all these in more recent decades, the question of indigenous knowledge systems also. Now, the challenge to universalism comes precisely from there. Now, universalist rhetoric speaks of emancipation of everybody and equality of everybody and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that that abstract universalism has always therefore made it impossible to speak the language of caste or community or identity, or any particularism has been debarred from expressing its voice. So eventually what happens, the crisis of universalisms emerges out of that way of outlawing, if I may say, a certain kind, all kinds of particularist voices. And so the political challenge cannot be simply a restatement of the universalisms. If we want to hold on to universalism of any kind, then that universalism has to be re-articulated with these various so-called particularistic identitarian concerns. How you do that? That is why I think it's important to see the universal, if anything, as an empty space, as a space which is a contested terrain. It is a terrain which is not there self-evident to us in all its ramifications and all its dimensions. It is something which is a state to be aspired to rather than a starting point, right? We can probably say that that universalism in that sense can only be a horizon, which we try to approach. By positing it as something which is our starting point, what we do is precisely reenact the old story, which prohibits the expression of any other dissonant voice. Now, the question of the Dalits and the lower caste in that context and the continuing tradition. Now, here also there is actually a need to make a distinction between two things. One, all tradition is not the same. So indigenous traditions are not based on caste. What we have done, and that is, I think, the big mistake or the big problem with the modern discourse, that everything that belongs to the past was seen as backward, reactionary, and so on and so forth. Whereas one needs to understand that there are, if one does away with this larger linear narrative of progress and looks back at traditions with in a plural and with a more complex sense of what is good and what is bad and what exists despite everything, which can continue to exist because it actually is so central to people's lives, and what needs to be. So the most abhorrent of the caste practices, of course, need to be not just contested, but they need to be challenged, refuted, even sometimes by force, because things like untouchability don't go without the use of force and some kind of legal punitive measures. So that is one level. The other thing is what we don't, and I think this is a point where I think usually the kind of questions that many Dalit scholars sometimes ask is that since colonialism provided the space against the domination of Brahminism and so on, and in a way modern knowledge provided the language of equality and so on, there is a kind of resistance to examining its other effects. Now that's a very one-sided story, because precisely that modernism, precisely that high modernism, and precisely, for example, in the case of Marxism, it is the language of class, which made it impossible to consider the specific histories of caste. And so you have to not, if you want to not reduce everything to class or to some kind of modern universal category, you have to allow for that possibility of looking at these specific histories in terms of their own logic, in terms of their own development. So when Dr. Ambedkar is, now he was a high modernist, he was a liberal modernist in a very significant sense, but people often see only that part of Ambedkar. The fact that Ambedkar is actually going deep into, he's rejecting all these categories of the Western, whether it's nation, whether it's class, and so on and so forth. He's looking at the internal dynamic of Hindu society. How does the Hindu society evolve? What are the ways in which Hindu society creates graded inequality? What are the ways in which, so he always works on riddles of Hinduism or the philosophy of Hinduism, and his eventual move towards Buddhism and so on show another aspect of Ambedkar's engagement, which is not rooted only in the modern. So the need to do away with or to step aside from, at least as in Ambedkar's case, even while being invested in the modern universalisms of liberalism and so on, still being prepared to step aside from it and being able to talk in terms of the specific histories of caste and caste oppression. And that is something which pushes towards the decolonizing project.
Thank you for your enriching answer. We have no more additional question, and it's almost 5. So I will take that final answer as the concluding answer. I would like to, first of all, thank Suren, Sepide, and Ali for organizing and helping us through this webinar. And I would like to also thank, obviously, Professor Nigam for his time, his generous answers to our question, and Professor Bange Rezako and Professor Sitas for their valuable intervention. And on that note, I will thank everyone for participating and attending this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
And just to announce for all attendees and panelists, our next seminar will be on November 19th, so in almost 20 days. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
To everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you, Samir.